KTN News.
Nikufiti sana leo, nikupoa sana usisleki sana wewe
Karibu Betting.
Betting on you.
This is KTN News.
It's more confusion for church leaders over politicians tempting donations as anti-graft agencies now warn clergy against corruption proceeds.
There's no white-collar suspect and a blue-collar suspect. A suspect is a suspect.
Ford Kenya leader Moses Wetangula now describes the gold scandal probe against him as inconsequential, as the office of the DPP says that he will record a statement over the same.
I'm not aware of what you are talking about, and it's a known issue to me, and I don't want to engage in it.
Tumesema hatutakubali kufanya kazi kwa hospitali mbaya kwenye patients hawapati ile tibabu wanafaa kupata.
Plus, despite the Kerugoya hospital being given a clean bill of health by the medical board, health workers in the county vowed to proceed with their scheduled strike, defying a court order that sought to block the move.
We advise the members of the public to be buying milk from the certified vendors, the ones that have been certified by the public health officer.
And 24 people hospitalized in Kapkatet Hospital in Bomet after consuming contaminated sour milk.
This is KTN News.
Welcome back. Yeah, that was a very long interview with the CS Treasury, Henry Rotich, just trying to explain to Kenyans and say, no, we're not in a debt crisis. And mark this, the only time we will not borrow is when we do not have a gap. So as long as we have a gap, we will always borrow. So let's have this conversation with Dr. XN Iraqi, who's an economist. Sir, thank you for staying with me. We've listened into that interview with you. So give me your scorecard of Kenya's debt situation as we speak.
I'm struggling to hear you.
Can you hear me?
No.
You're struggling to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, give me a... Sorry? Can you hear me now? Dr. Iraqi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay. So CS Henry Rotich says, no, we are not in a debt crisis. The only time we will not borrow is when you do not have a gap. And clearly, it's going to be a long time before Kenya has a gap. So give me your assessment of Kenya's debt situation now.
My assessment might not be as elaborate as the CS because I'm not in the government. I'm an outsider. He's an insider. But I agree with him to some extent that Kenya is not as indebted as everybody wants to claim. If you look at the natural way of measuring the indebtedness of a country, you compare the debt with the GDP, the gross domestic product. When I look at the GDP, or when you look at the debt GDP ratio of some countries like Japan, US, Singapore, or even Greece, Egypt, or even Canada, I see them much higher than Kenya. So I don't think we are as bad as everybody is claiming. What should be the concern is not whether we have debt. It is whether we put our debt into the right use. And as long as the debt is put to the right use, people see the effect, they see the infrastructure, they see improvement in their lives. I don't think that is a bad thing. After all, who among us does not have some debt?
Really?
Yes.
So the question is whether or not we put the debt in the right use. Listening into the stories that have been coming from the money that Kenya has been borrowing and how it has been put to use, are you convinced that it has been put to right use? And I think part of the reason why Kenyans are concerned is because the country is borrowing, but the revenue that we are generating is not commensurate with what we are borrowing. And the question is, how long will it take us to even pay this debt? Because what we do know, I remember the Controller of Budget raised the red flag saying that public debt will not work, saying that this country stands to spend more than 61 billion out of every 100 billion collected. So out of 100 billion collected, we are spending 61 billion for debt repayment, and that is what is concerning Kenyans.
I think it's a concern that we are putting too much money into repayment of debt. But I think I would want to put a very simple question to every Kenyan. You don't want the government to borrow money, but you want the best services, the best education, the best hospitals, the best highways. Where should the government get money from? My alternative would be raise the taxes. But Kenyans don't want the taxes to be raised. So at the end of the day, one area must give in. And that's why the government wants to borrow money instead of raising the taxes. But I can tell you for free that the reason why Kenyans are so annoyed and why they are very emotional about the issue of debt is not so much because there is a lot of debt. It's because there's a belief on the streets that a lot of the money that is borrowed is taken up by corruption. And people believe that if we can reduce corruption, we don't need to borrow. But even if corruption was free, or even if there was no corruption at all, I think we would still need to borrow some money for development projects.
Probably if that corruption was not there, Kenyans would not need to borrow as much as we're borrowing right now.
Very correct, but they will still borrow.
Yeah, we'll still borrow.
But less.
Yeah, and when you're talking about that, let's talk about the issue of accountability. ANC leader Musalia Mudavadi posed a question. He said, how long will this reckless borrowing without accountability go on? The Jubilee government and their partners must now tell Kenyans the true level of the country's indebtedness and detailed terms and conditions around each debt. And he's actually, he gave a suggestion saying that perhaps we should establish an independent public debt management authority to manage present debt and future borrowing. Is that a route you think Kenya should take?
If you look at that debate, the issue is not whether we come up with an independent authority or not. The issue is, will the public get the right information? Will they get the information they want about debt? So the issue is not whether we have an independent body or not. It is whether we are going to get the information that we want. I think the issue of debt and other big policy issues are not explained the way they are supposed to be explained. And I'll give you an example of the discussion that has just ended before me with C.S. Rotich.
Yes.
He used a lot of technical jargon. For example, what is crowding to a person on the streets? So one way to make accountable much easier to appreciate to the citizens on the streets is to use the ordinary language. Don't use jargon. Use very plain language. If we can do that, then people will see accountability. We have IT nowadays. We have website, government websites, and so on. If all the information about the money that we borrow and what we do with it is available publicly, then people will not complain about accountability because the information is publicly available. If you don't give people information, they become suspicious. They even come up with their own information. So let's make information as available as possible. If any person has any question about the money we borrow and how we use it, let it be plainly available. And people will not ask questions.
Okay. So this latest amount that Kenya is taking from the World Bank, 75 billion, doesn't bother you?
It bothers me in one way. Where will that money be? What will that money be used for?
Apparently it's supposed to be used to implement the Big Four agenda.
Which of the big four?
All four of them.
All four of them. Which one specifically? I think one thing the government can do, and I'm not in the government, is probably to be more specific. And I like the way Sophie Wanuna was asking the questions. This is the money you borrowed. What exactly are you going to do with it? Should we talk about the forest or should we talk about the trees? My suspicion is we should talk more about the trees because they give us more information. in my opinion.
Okay, so you've said CS Rotich, just speaking to Sophia Wanuna, used a lot of jargons just to explain the scenario Kenya finds herself in. From where you sit, in a minute, because I need to wrap this up, I need you to explain to Kenyans, in the simplest language that you can, where we find ourselves in terms of debt and the way out for the country, as simple as you can.
We find ourselves in a situation where we are borrowing faster, or the debt is growing faster than expected. If the debt grows very fast, then it means that you are going to eventually find yourself unable to pay that debt. So the option is to borrow less. And if you have to borrow less, you have to look for an alternative source of funds. And I see two alternative sources of funds for this country. One of them is to reduce corruption. The second one is to reduce waste. I think there are a lot of sectors in the economy where we can reduce waste. And if we reduce waste, we reduce corruption, we may not need as much debt as we have now. Because eventually somebody has to pay that debt. But if we borrow that money and we use it to increase the productive capacity of the economy, I think this economy will be on the right path. Great nations, whether it is the US, Japan, or in any big great country you talk about, they use some debt to develop themselves and make the economy better for their country or better for their citizens. And I don't see why we cannot do that if we have the political will.
So far, Kenya is not in a bad place from where you sit?
I don't think it's a bad place. It is manageable. We have not, as the CS said, we have not yet failed to pay the debt. I don't think we have been listed as a country that cannot be able to honor its debt obligations.
Is that the benchmark, really?
It's a benchmark. What is the other benchmark that we can use to show that you are not able to manage your debt apart from that?
You may be paying, but as long as with the payment you're dragging, you're drowning, is that the benchmark, really?
We can come up with an alternative way of showing that debt is being managed by looking at the economic growth.
Okay.
If the economy grows because we are borrowing debt and everybody on the streets feels that, then we can say that the debt is good. The same way when you borrow money yourself as an individual, you're supposed to show what you have done with that money. Have you come up with a house? Have you come up with something? But you cannot borrow money to go and get a second wife or to go and spend a few days in a hotel. Borrowed money should always be put into some good use, whether it is for an individual or for a country. And that's what everybody on the streets is looking for.
Yeah, it's okay to borrow, but put it to good use. That's a good place to end this conversation. Sir, yes. A very big thank you for being part of the big story this evening, Dr. X, an Iraqi, an economist. Thank you so much for your insight on this. A big thank you as well to our lead reporter, Sophia Wanuna, who spoke to Henry Rotich, who's the CS National Treasury. Allow me to leave it at that. This has been the big story. I'm Linda Ogutu.